Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the absolute psychological nightmare that was the reign of Emperor Caligula. The 4-year fever dream that nearly turned the Roman Empire from a world-conquering superpower into the ancient equivalent of a reality TV show, hosted by someone who'd completely lost touch with reality. So before we begin this journey into imperial madness, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy watching me dissect historical train wrecks with the respect they deserve. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world to collectively marvel at how spectacularly humans can mess things up when given unlimited power. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a warm drink, because this is going to be a long one. And let's settle in for tonight's exploration of what happens when absolute authority meets complete insanity. Turn on that fan for some soft background noise, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for the story of how a nickname that meant "little boots" became synonymous with megalomaniacal excess and creative cruelty. So, you think you could handle being a Roman citizen under Caligula's rule? Charming. Truly? Like thinking you could survive a tornado by politely asking it to go around your house. You imagine you'd just keep your head down, avoid imperial attention, maybe even find the whole thing darkly amusing from a safe distance. Sweet summer child, let me tell you exactly why that optimism would have gotten you killed, tortured, or at minimum forced to participate in whatever theatrical nightmare the emperor had dreamed up that particular week. Because this isn't just the story of one man's descent into madness. This is the story of how an entire civilization had to adapt to living under someone who treated reality like a rough draft that needed constant revision, usually involving more costume changes and public executions. This is about what happens when the most powerful person in the world decides that normal human limitations don't apply to them, and everyone else has to pretend that makes perfect sense while quietly planning for survival. Tonight, we're going to walk through those 4 years, 10 months, and 8 days when Rome discovered that sometimes the cure for a boring emperor is much, much worse than the original problem. We're going to see how quickly a promising young ruler can transform from the people's hope into their worst nightmare, and how an empire that had conquered most of the known world nearly collapsed under the weight of one man's unlimited power and complete detachment from anything resembling sanity. So settle in, because we're about to explore the reign of Caligula, where every day was like living inside someone else's fever dream, and the only way out was through assassination. Welcome to the show where historical analysis meets therapeutic processing of collective trauma, and tonight's trauma is brought to you by absolute power corrupting absolutely, with a side of theatrical megalomania and a garnish of creative violence. Let's begin. So there you are, standing in the Roman Forum on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday in 37 AD, minding your own business, buying overpriced fish sauce from a vendor who definitely waters down his product, when suddenly the world changes forever. Not because of an earthquake or barbarian invasion, or even a particularly aggressive tax collector, but because a 24-year-old with daddy issues and unlimited power has just become the most dangerous man in the known world. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but everyone called him Caligula, which means little boots in Latin. Adorable nickname, right? The kind of pet name that makes you think of a toddler stumbling around in oversized sandals, maybe getting his toga twisted up while chasing butterflies through the garden. And that's exactly what Roman soldiers started calling him when he was just a child, toddling around military camps wearing miniature versions of their standard issue footwear, while his father Germanicus conquered barbarians and made the Rhine his personal bathtub. But here's the thing about cute nicknames for future emperors: they have a tendency to age like milk left in the Mediterranean sun. By the time Caligula took power, those little boots had grown into the feet of a man who would declare war on Neptune, make his horse a consul, and turn the Roman Empire into his personal playground of increasingly creative cruelty. The soldiers who once cooed over his tiny footwear probably wished they'd just called him Future Nightmare and saved everyone the trouble. Picture this: you're a Roman citizen living in what you genuinely believe is the greatest civilization ever to grace the earth. You've got aqueducts bringing fresh water to your door, roads so well built they'll still be there 2,000 years later, and gladiator fights every weekend for entertainment. Life is good, or at least as good as it gets when you're constantly worried about dying from infected splinters or having your city sacked by angry Germans. Then Tiberius dies, and everyone breathes a collective sigh of relief, because let's be honest, the old emperor had spent the last decade of his reign sulking on an island, like a particularly vindictive hermit crab. Sure, he'd been competent enough at running the empire, but he'd also developed a disturbing habit of having people thrown off cliffs for entertainment, which was really putting a damper on the dinner party scene in Rome. So when this young, charismatic grandson of the beloved Augustus takes power, the people are genuinely excited. Finally, someone who isn't old and bitter and obsessed with creative executions. Someone who might actually show up to public events without scowling at everyone like they've personally offended him. The crowds lined the streets, cheering for their new emperor, probably thinking they'd gotten lucky for once in their historically tragic lives. What they actually got was a lesson in why you should never trust anyone whose childhood was spent watching people get fed to lions for breakfast entertainment. Because Caligula hadn't just grown up in the imperial palace, he'd been marinated in power and violence and the kind of absolute authority that turns normal human empathy into something resembling a vestigial organ, like an appendix or your ability to be shocked by Roman excess. The early signs were actually pretty encouraging. If you ignored the fact that encouraging signs from Caligula were like beautiful weather before a hurricane, technically pleasant, but also a really bad omen for what was coming next. He started his reign by being generous to the people, hosting lavish games, giving bonuses to the Praetorian Guard, and generally behaving like someone who'd read the How to Be a Popular Emperor handbook and was following it to the letter. He recalled political exiles, freed prisoners who'd been rotting in dungeons under Tiberius, and even published the imperial budget so people could see where their tax money was going, which was refreshingly honest for a Roman emperor, most of whom treated government finances like a magic trick where money disappeared and somehow more palaces appeared. But here's where things started getting weird. And by weird I mean the kind of weird that makes you seriously reconsider your life choices and possibly your citizenship. Because Caligula didn't just want to be popular, he wanted to be worshipped. Not metaphorically worshipped, the way people might say they worship their favorite gladiator or really good wine. Actually worship, with altars and sacrifices and the whole religious experience. Now, Romans were no strangers to emperor worship. It was basically part of the job description. Like having to wear a laurel wreath and pretend to enjoy listening to poets recite epic verses about your glorious deeds. But there was usually at least a thin veneer of modesty about it, a polite fiction that everyone maintained where the emperor was definitely divine, but also maybe just a really impressive mortal who happened to have godlike qualities. Caligula looked at this polite fiction and decided it was for cowards and weaklings who lacked vision. He demanded immediate deification, not after death like a normal emperor, but right now, while he could properly enjoy it. He had statues of himself placed in temples, replacing the heads of various gods with his own likeness, which must have been really confusing for people trying to figure out whether they were praying to Jupiter or their increasingly unhinged ruler. He also developed what historians politely call delusions of grandeur, which is academic speak for completely lost touch with reality and started believing his own publicity. He claimed to have conversations with the moon, insisted that various gods were his personal friends, and once allegedly tried to make his favourite horse, Incitatus, a consul of Rome, which, to be fair, wouldn't have been the worst appointment in Roman history. But it was definitely the first time anyone had seriously considered giving legislative authority to something that communicated primarily through neighing. The horse thing, by the way, wasn't just random weirdness for its own sake. It was a very pointed insult to the Roman Senate, a way of saying that he considered his horse more qualified to help govern the empire than the entire collection of supposedly distinguished senators who'd spent their whole lives training for public service. It was the ancient equivalent of appointing your pet goldfish as Secretary of State, except with more serious consequences for everyone involved. And the consequences were starting to pile up like bodies after a particularly enthusiastic gladiator tournament. Because Caligula wasn't content to just be weird and megalomaniacal in private, he needed an audience for his increasingly elaborate displays of power and cruelty. He turned public executions into theatrical performances, complete with elaborate staging and costume changes. He forced senators to run beside his chariot in their togas, which sounds hilarious until you remember that Roman roads were basically stone obstacle courses designed to break ankles and dignity in equal measure. He also started treating the imperial treasury like his personal piggy bank, which would have been fine if he'd had any concept of fiscal responsibility or mathematical reality. But Caligula approached spending money the way a toddler approaches a candy store. Everything looked amazing, and he wanted it all right now, regardless of consequences or whether it would fit in his metaphorical stomach. He threw lavish parties that made Gatsby look frugal, built enormous ships for his personal amusement, and constructed a temporary bridge across the Bay of Naples, just so he could ride across it wearing a golden breastplate that had allegedly belonged to Alexander the Great. The bridge served no practical purpose, except to prove that he could build a bridge wherever he wanted, which is exactly the kind of logic that makes perfect sense when you're completely insane and also happen to control the world's most powerful military. The parties. Oh gods, the parties. These weren't your typical Roman banquets with reasonable amounts of wine and conversation about philosophy, and maybe some light entertainment involving exotic dancers and trained bears. These were multi-day extravaganzas that consumed resources like a locust swarm with a government credit card. Picture this: you're a wealthy Roman citizen, and you receive an invitation to dine with the emperor. You're excited, naturally, because this is the social event of the century, the kind of thing you'll be talking about for the rest of your life, assuming you survive it. You put on your finest toga, practice your most impressive conversation topics, and show up at the palace expecting sophisticated discourse and maybe some really good wine. Instead, you find yourself at what can only be described as a fever dream designed by someone who's read too many stories about the gods and decided to reenact them with unlimited resources and no adult supervision. The dining room has been transformed into a fake ocean, complete with ships and mechanical sea monsters. Actors dressed as various deities perform increasingly bizarre theatrical pieces while exotic animals wander freely among the guests, who are trying very hard to pretend this is all perfectly normal. Caligula himself appears dressed as different gods throughout the evening, changing costumes between courses like a deranged variety show host. One moment he's Neptune, complete with trident and artificial beard, demanding that everyone toast his recent victory over the sea, which consisted of his soldiers collecting seashells as spoils of war. The next moment he's Venus, in full dragon makeup, expecting everyone to compose impromptu love poetry about his divine beauty. And you can't leave. That's the truly terrifying part. You're trapped in this increasingly surreal nightmare, watching your emperor descend further into madness with each costume change, while the most powerful people in Rome pretend that everything is absolutely fine and actually quite entertaining. Thank you very much for asking. Because that's what everyone did. They pretended it was fine. They had to. The alternative was to acknowledge that the most powerful man in the world was completely out of his mind. And that's not the kind of conversation that tends to end well for the people having it. So senators applauded when Caligula declared war on Neptune and ordered his soldiers to attack the waves with their swords. Citizens cheered when he appeared in public dressed as various goddesses. Everyone went along with the increasingly elaborate charade, because the alternative was admitting that their entire civilization was being run by someone who belonged in a very secure medical facility, not a palace. The treasury, meanwhile, was hemorrhaging money like a severed artery. Tiberius had left behind a surplus of nearly 3 billion sestertii, which was an absolutely enormous amount of money by any standard, ancient or modern. It should have been enough to fund the empire for decades, pay for infrastructure improvements, military expansions, and maybe even some modest tax cuts for the increasingly burdened citizens. Caligula spent it all in less than a year. Every last coin, gone, vanished into a black hole of megalomaniacal excess and theatrical props. He spent money on things that hadn't even been invented yet, commissioning artists to create new forms of luxury that existed purely to be more expensive than anything that had come before. He had precious gems crushed up and mixed into his food, not because it tasted good, but because he wanted to literally consume wealth in the most wasteful way possible. When he ran out of his inheritance, he started inventing new taxes with the creativity of a bureaucrat who's been given hallucinogens and told to maximize revenue. Tax on lawsuits, tax on weddings, tax on divorce, tax on having too many slaves, tax on not having enough slaves, tax on complaining about taxes. He turned the entire empire into a giant extortion scheme with himself as the primary beneficiary. He also started selling positions in government to the highest bidder, which would have been standard corruption, except that Caligula kept changing his mind about what the positions actually entailed. One day you might buy the governorship of a province. The next day you'd find out you'd actually purchased the right to clean the imperial stables while dressed as a dancing girl. The legal system became a casino where the house always won and the odds changed without notice. But the money problems were just symptoms of the larger issue, which was that Caligula had decided that reality was optional and laws were more like suggestions that he could ignore whenever they became inconvenient. He started making decisions based on dreams, omens, and what he claimed were direct conversations with various deities who apparently had very specific opinions about Roman foreign policy. He declared war on Britain, then decided to invade Germany instead, then changed his mind and declared victory over both without actually fighting anyone. His soldiers were ordered to collect seashells and stones as spoils of war from their great triumph over Neptune, and they had to pretend this made perfect sense, because questioning the emperor's military strategy was considered treason, and treason was punishable by creative execution methods that made crucifixion look merciful. The executions, speaking of which, became increasingly elaborate performance art pieces. Caligula didn't just want people dead, he wanted them to die in ways that would be remembered, discussed, and probably traumatize witnesses for the rest of their natural lives. He turned murder into theatre, complete with costumes, scripted dialogue, and audience participation segments where spectators were expected to cheer at appropriate moments. He forced parents to watch their children's executions, then invited them to dinner afterward and expected them to behave as if nothing had happened. He made jokes during torture sessions, not because he found cruelty funny, but because he wanted everyone to know that human suffering was just entertainment for him, no more significant than a particularly amusing mime performance. The Praetorian Guard, meanwhile, was having a collective nervous breakdown. These were professional soldiers, trained to protect the emperor with their lives, and they were discovering that the person they'd sworn to protect was actively working to destroy everything they'd been trained to preserve. They watched him humiliate senators, bankrupt the treasury, and turn the dignity of the Roman Empire into a punchline for his increasingly deranged comedy routine. But they couldn't do anything about it, not directly, because their oath was to the office of emperor, not to the empire itself. They were trapped in a loyalty bind that would have made a philosopher weep, sworn to protect a man who was systematically destroying everything they actually cared about. It was like being a bodyguard for someone who insisted on juggling grenades in crowded theatres. The people of Rome, initially so excited about their young, charismatic emperor, were starting to realize they'd made a terrible mistake. The games and public entertainments continued, but they took on an increasingly sinister tone as Caligula used them to demonstrate his power over life and death. A gladiator fight wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was a reminder that the emperor could order anyone into the arena at any time, for any reason, or no reason at all. Citizens started disappearing. Not just political enemies or rival claimants to power, but random people who'd somehow attracted the emperor's attention in ways they couldn't predict or avoid. Maybe they'd looked at him wrong during a public appearance. Maybe they'd failed to laugh at one of his jokes. Maybe they'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time when he needed someone to demonstrate a point about absolute power. The atmosphere in Rome became like that moment in a horror movie when the characters realize the friendly stranger they've been talking to is actually the serial killer, except they can't run away because they're all trapped in the same empire with him. People started avoiding public spaces, speaking in whispers, and developing elaborate strategies for becoming invisible whenever the emperor was around. But Caligula didn't want to be avoided. He wanted to be adored, worshipped, and constantly entertained by the suffering of others. So he started dragging people into his presence, whether they wanted to be there or not, forcing them to participate in increasingly bizarre ceremonies designed to celebrate his divinity and reinforce his complete authority over their lives. He held mock trials where he played all the roles: judge, prosecutor, defense attorney, and jury. The verdicts were predetermined, but the process was elaborate and theatrical, with costume changes and dramatic monologues that could last for hours. People were forced to sit through these performances, applauding at designated moments, while watching their friends and neighbors get sentenced to death for crimes that existed only in the emperor's imagination. The Roman legal system, once the proud foundation of imperial administration, became a game show hosted by a madman. Laws were created and abolished on whims. Punishments were assigned based on entertainment value rather than proportionality, and the concept of justice became whatever amused Caligula at any given moment. He started demanding that people worship him in increasingly specific and humiliating ways. It wasn't enough to acknowledge his divinity, you had to do it correctly, with the right words, the right gestures, the right expression of awe and terror. He had protocols developed for approaching his presence, elaborate rituals that changed without notice and were designed to be impossible to perform perfectly, ensuring that everyone would eventually fail and provide him with an excuse for punishment. The palace became a maze of paranoia and performance anxiety, where everyone was constantly auditioning for their lives without knowing the script or the criteria for success. Senators practiced their bowing techniques. Citizens rehearsed their expressions of reverent joy, and everyone tried to figure out how to be sufficiently worshipful without appearing to be mocking the whole absurd process. Foreign diplomats arriving in Rome found themselves in a surreal nightmare where standard diplomatic protocols had been replaced with whatever theatrical production Caligula was currently starring in. Ambassadors expecting serious negotiations about trade agreements or territorial disputes instead found themselves forced to participate in elaborate costume dramas where they had to pretend the Roman emperor was actually Jupiter disguised. One delegation from Egypt reportedly spent 3 days dressed as various mythological creatures, participating in a reenactment of some story Caligula had either dreamed or invented, before finally being allowed to discuss the grain shipments that were the actual purpose of their visit. They went home with trade agreements and probably severe psychological trauma from having to pretend to be centaurs while negotiating import duties. The military was experiencing its own unique form of institutional breakdown. Caligula loved playing soldier, but his version of military command involved more costume changes than actual strategy. He would appear at army camps dressed as different historical generals, expecting his soldiers to react as if they were suddenly serving under Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar, depending on which outfit he'd chosen that day. Training exercises became theatrical performances where troops had to pretend to fight against mythological enemies or reenact famous battles with Caligula playing all the starring roles simultaneously. Soldiers who'd spent their careers learning actual military tactics found themselves drilling in choreographed dance routines designed to celebrate the emperor's divine nature, rather than preparing for real combat. The frontier legions, meanwhile, were receiving increasingly bizarre orders that made no tactical sense and often seemed designed purely to waste resources and confuse everyone involved. Units were ordered to march in circles, build bridges to nowhere, and collect various natural specimens for the emperor's personal museum of divine artifacts, which apparently included rocks that looked like him and shells that reminded him of his conversations with Neptune. Veteran centurions, men who'd spent decades mastering the art of warfare, found themselves trying to explain to their troops why they were now required to salute seagulls, build sandcastles for the emperor's approval, and participate in mock naval battles on artificial lakes that served no strategic purpose whatsoever. military discipline, once the backbone of Roman expansion, became a comedy routine performed by increasingly demoralized professional soldiers. The economic consequences of all this madness were becoming impossible to ignore, even by people who'd become experts at ignoring inconvenient realities. The treasury was empty, tax collection had become pure extortion, and commerce was grinding to a halt as merchants tried to figure out what bizarre new regulations might be imposed on them without warning. Trade agreements negotiated under previous emperors were being randomly modified or cancelled based on Caligula's dreams. Diplomatic relationships were deteriorating as foreign powers tried to figure out how to deal with an empire run by someone who seemed to be living in an entirely different reality, and the economic foundation of Roman prosperity was crumbling under the weight of increasingly absurd imperial demands. Craftsmen found themselves commissioned to create impossible objects. Artists were ordered to paint portraits of the emperor as various gods with increasingly specific and contradictory requirements, and architects were designing buildings that defied both physics and common sense, but perfectly reflected Caligula's vision of himself as a divine being who wasn't bound by normal limitations. The result was an empire that was simultaneously the most powerful military force in the world, and a complete joke. A civilization that had conquered most of the known world, but couldn't maintain basic administrative functions because its leader was too busy playing dress up to govern effectively. It was like watching a superpower run by a toddler who'd gotten into his mother's makeup and declared himself king of everything. But toddlers eventually take naps, and their tantrums have natural limits imposed by biology and exhaustion. Caligula's madness, fed by absolute power and surrounded by people who were too terrified to provide any reality checks, just kept escalating. Each day brought new innovations in cruelty, new experiments in humiliation, and new demonstrations that there were no limits to how far he could go, because no one had the authority or courage to stop him. He started planning increasingly grandiose projects that would have bankrupted the empire, even if it hadn't already been broke. A new palace that would cover half of Rome, with rooms designed to look like different planets so he could hold court in appropriate divine settings. A canal that would connect every major river in the empire, allowing him to travel by boat from Britain to Egypt while remaining on Roman territory. A giant statue of himself that would be visible from the moon, assuming the moon wanted to look down and admire his divine features. These projects were announced with great fanfare. Plans were drawn up by architects who knew they were designing impossibilities, and work began on foundations that would never support the structures they were meant to hold. But pointing out these practical problems was considered criticism of the emperor's divine vision, and criticism was treason, so everyone pretended that building a statue the size of a mountain was a perfectly reasonable use of imperial resources. The religious establishment was having its own crisis, as traditional Roman gods were systematically replaced or merged with Caligula's personal mythology. Priests found themselves conducting services for deities they'd never heard of, performing rituals that changed daily based on the emperor's latest theological insights, and trying to explain to confused worshippers why Jupiter was now apparently just one aspect of Caligula's divine nature. Temple finances became as chaotic as the imperial treasury, with sacred treasures being confiscated to fund the emperor's projects. Religious festivals being modified to celebrate his achievements, and ancient traditions being rewritten to incorporate whatever religious visions he'd had most recently. The gods themselves seemed to be experiencing an identity crisis, as their traditional roles and relationships were reorganized according to Caligula's personal preferences. Augurs, whose job it was to interpret omens and divine will, found themselves in the impossible position of having to provide supernatural validation for whatever the emperor wanted to do, regardless of what the actual omens suggested. Birds flying in the wrong direction had to be reinterpreted as signs of divine approval. Unusual weather patterns became confirmations of imperial wisdom, and any natural phenomena that might be construed as negative omens were either ignored or creatively reinterpreted until they supported whatever narrative Caligula preferred. The calendar itself became unstable as Caligula decided that certain days should be renamed after his victories. Months should be reorganized to better reflect his divine nature, and various holidays should be moved or modified to provide more opportunities for public worship of his magnificence. Citizens trying to keep track of dates found themselves living in a temporal system that changed without notice and followed no logic beyond the emperor's whims. Marriage and family life became increasingly surreal as Caligula's ideas about appropriate behavior filtered down through Roman society. He'd married his own sister, divorced her, married her again, then declared her a goddess, then had her exiled, then recalled her for a family dinner where everyone had to pretend the whole sequence of events was perfectly normal and possibly even touching evidence of imperial devotion. Other Roman families, taking their cues from the imperial example, found themselves navigating a social landscape where traditional relationships and obligations might be randomly redefined by imperial decree. Husbands could be ordered to divorce their wives so the emperor could marry them temporarily as part of some elaborate ceremony. Children could be adopted into the imperial family for the duration of a particular festival, and entire bloodlines could be declared divine or cursed depending on Caligula's current opinion of their genealogy. The education system, such as it was, began incorporating lessons about the emperor's divine nature and personal mythology, with traditional subjects like rhetoric and philosophy being supplemented by courses in proper imperial worship techniques and the theological implications of Caligula's latest religious innovations. Students found themselves memorizing prayers to their emperor instead of learning useful skills, and teachers had to constantly update their curricula to reflect whatever new aspects of divinity he'd discovered about himself. Public works projects became increasingly disconnected from any practical purpose, as they were redesigned to serve as monuments to imperial magnificence rather than useful infrastructure. Roads were built to lead nowhere, but impressive viewpoints where citizens could better appreciate statues of the emperor. Aqueducts were modified to create decorative fountains shaped like his face, and bridges were constructed purely to provide dramatic backdrops for imperial processions. The result was an empire where nothing worked properly, because everything had been redesigned to serve the psychological needs of one increasingly unhinged individual. It was like living in a theme park designed by and for a narcissist with unlimited resources and no understanding of how actual civilizations function. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the whole situation was how normal it all started to seem to people who lived through it day by day. Humans are remarkably adaptable creatures, capable of adjusting to almost any circumstances if the changes happen gradually enough. Citizens who would have been horrified by Caligula's behavior if they'd seen it all at once found themselves slowly accommodating each new level of madness, adjusting their expectations and behaviors until they were living in a completely different world from the one they'd inhabited just a few years earlier. People developed strategies for surviving encounters with the emperor, techniques for appearing sufficiently worshipful without seeming to mock the process, and methods for maintaining some semblance of normal life while participating in whatever theatrical production he'd cast them in. They became experts at reading his moods, anticipating his demands, and protecting themselves and their families from the consequences of his unpredictable attention. Children grew up thinking this was what emperors were supposed to be like, that governance naturally involved costume changes and conversations with imaginary deities, and that the primary function of government was to provide entertainment for the person in charge, rather than services for the people being governed. An entire generation was being raised to think that absolute power and complete insanity were not just compatible but actually the same thing. The Praetorian Guard, meanwhile, was reaching the breaking point of their institutional patience. These were men who dedicated their lives to protecting the imperial office, and they were watching that office become a laughingstock and a threat to everything they'd sworn to preserve. They'd endured the humiliations, participated in the charades, and maintained their loyalty through increasingly difficult circumstances. But there were limits to how much institutional degradation they could accept. The final straw came when Caligula announced his intention to move the capital of the empire to Alexandria, where he planned to be worshipped as pharaoh and implement his vision of divine monarchy without the inconvenient constraints of Roman law and tradition. He would abandon Rome, leave the Senate to govern itself or dissolve entirely, and establish a new form of government based purely on his personal relationship with various Egyptian deities. This wasn't just another eccentric imperial project. It was the complete abandonment of everything Rome represented. The Praetorian Guard realized they were facing a choice between their oath to protect the emperor and their deeper loyalty to the empire itself. They tried to serve both, but Caligula had made it impossible by becoming a threat to the very institution they'd sworn to defend. The conspiracy that formed wasn't driven by personal ambition or political ideology. It was a desperate attempt by career soldiers to save their civilization from someone who was determined to destroy it through sheer narcissistic excess. They'd watched him humiliate the Senate, bankrupt the treasury, alienate foreign allies, demoralize the military, and turn Roman governance into a combination of theatre and theology that served no one's interests except his own. On January 24, 41 AD, just 3 years, 10 months, and 8 days after he'd taken power to such great popular acclaim, Caligula was assassinated by members of his own Praetorian Guard as he was leaving a theatrical performance. The irony was probably not lost on anyone involved. A man who'd turned his entire reign into a theatrical performance was killed while leaving an actual theatre, finally bringing down the curtain on the most surreal tragedy in Roman history. The conspirators didn't kill him because they hated him personally, though that was certainly part of it, but because they'd realized that the alternative to assassination was watching the Roman Empire collapse under the weight of his madness. They'd tried everything else: accommodation, participation, enabling, and hoping he'd eventually grow tired of the whole performance and settle down into something resembling normal imperial behavior. But Caligula had shown no signs of moderating his behavior. If anything, he was escalating, constantly searching for new ways to demonstrate his divine nature and absolute power. Each concession they made to his madness just encouraged him to push further. Each humiliation they accepted just proved to him that there were no limits to what he could do with impunity. The assassination was quick and brutal, the kind of efficient violence that professional soldiers excel at when they finally decided that violence is the only solution to an intractable problem. There were no elaborate speeches or dramatic confrontations, no attempts to reason with him or give him opportunities to change his behavior. They simply killed him, efficiently and thoroughly, ending his reign the same way they might end any other threat to Roman security. The immediate aftermath was chaos, as usually happens when you suddenly remove the central authority from an empire, even when that authority has been completely insane. The conspirators hadn't really planned for what would happen after the assassination. Their primary goal had been to stop Caligula from continuing to destroy everything they cared about, and they'd focused all their energy on that immediate problem. The Senate, suddenly freed from the need to pretend that their emperor's madness was actually divine wisdom, found themselves trying to figure out how to govern an empire that had been systematically stripped of functional institutions over the previous 4 years. The treasury was empty, the military was demoralized and confused, foreign relationships had been damaged by years of erratic behavior, and the basic administrative apparatus of government had been converted into props for theatrical performances. Claudius, Caligula's uncle, was found hiding behind a curtain in the palace, apparently expecting to be killed along with the rest of the imperial family. Instead, he found himself proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guard, who needed someone from the imperial bloodline to legitimize their coup and provide stability during the transition. It was probably not the career path he'd planned for himself, but it was better than being murdered for being related to Caligula. The new emperor's first challenge was convincing people that he was actually sane, which required undoing years of imperial behavior that had conditioned everyone to expect complete unpredictability from their rulers. Citizens and officials alike had become so accustomed to madness as the default state of imperial governance that normal, rational decision-making seemed almost suspicious by comparison. Claudius had to systematically reverse or modify most of Caligula's policies, not because they were necessarily bad ideas, but because they were completely disconnected from reality and impossible to implement with actual resources and real people. Projects were cancelled, taxes were reformed, Diplomatic relationships were repaired, and the basic functions of government were restored to something resembling rationality. But the damage couldn't be entirely undone. A generation of Romans had lived through the experience of watching their civilization almost destroy itself because one person with unlimited power had been completely insane. And that's not the kind of collective trauma that disappears just because you get a new, more reasonable emperor. The memory of Caligula's reign became a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power, but it was also a reminder of how fragile civilization really is. All those institutions and traditions and systems of government that seem so solid and permanent can be reduced to rubble in just a few years by one person who refuses to accept the basic limitations of reality. People who lived through those years carried the knowledge that everything they thought was stable and predictable could be swept away without warning, that the difference between civilization and chaos might be nothing more than the mental health of whoever happens to be in charge. They'd learned that power without constraints doesn't just corrupt, it can completely destroy the ability to distinguish between fantasy and reality, turning governance into a form of performance art that serves no one except the performer. The Roman Empire survived Caligula's madness, but it was fundamentally changed by the experience. Future emperors would face different expectations and constraints. The Praetorian Guard had established a precedent for removing emperors who became too dangerous, and the entire system had been reminded that absolute power requires at least some connection to consensual reality in order to function. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Caligula's reign was the demonstration that individual psychology matters enormously in systems where individual power is concentrated. All the institutional checks and balances in the world can't protect a civilization from a leader who is genuinely, completely insane and has the authority to impose that insanity on everyone else. The little boy in the little boots had grown up to nearly destroy the greatest empire in human history, not through external conquest or natural disaster, but simply by being given unlimited power while being completely detached from reality. It was a lesson that would be repeated throughout history, in different times and places, whenever societies decided to concentrate too much authority in individuals without adequate safeguards against the very human tendency for power to destroy the ability to exercise it wisely. And somewhere in the Roman Forum, that fish sauce vendor probably went back to watering down his product, grateful that the world had returned to the kind of ordinary corruption and everyday dishonesty that makes civilization possible, rather than the extraordinary madness that had almost made it impossible. Sometimes the most profound political lesson is simply appreciating the difference between normal human failings and the complete abandonment of sanity, between the everyday compromises that keep society functioning and the kind of absolute power that turns governance into a 4-year fever dream from which an entire empire was lucky to wake up.